And here, I thought dark fantasy was just trying to read Lord of the Rings at night. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to it in the description below, and it's going to give you a pretty good overview of what we do here at the Horror Movie Syllabus, which in short is we look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. But this is our doctorate level series. This is where we revisit a subgenre that we've already explored, something that we already did a video on, and we do a quick recap of that video, and then we pick a new 4th doctorate level selection, something that's either a little lesser known or maybe lesser appreciated or maybe a little newer, or something that's just a little bit off the beaten path that we didn't talk about in the previous video. And it just gives an opportunity to talk a little bit more about a particular subgenre. And the subgenre that we're revisiting today is the dark fantasy subgenre. Now, when we talked about this previously, we talked about how this is a kind of a niche subgenre. Even amongst a group of niche subgenres, this one feels a little bit more niche. It doesn't seem like there's as many entries in this subgenre, and it maybe just because it's kind of like an aspect of the fantasy genre, right? Dark fantasy is just a darker version of fantasy. It's a little bit edgier, a little bit scarier, maybe a little bit more horror-esque. And we talked about a little bit about whether or not dark fantasy really is truly horror. And you know me, I always call it horror. So we just said, yeah, we're going to talk about this stuff because I tend to like these things. I tend to think they're pretty cool. Now, sometimes they're not really all that scary. They're maybe sometimes a little bit more for children. We talked about that in the previous video. And I'll tell you right now, the movies we're talking about today, not for children, but there are some that we talked about that were for children in the previous video. And we're going to do a recap of those right now. The first dark fantasy movie that we talked about in our previous video was Labyrinth. And Labyrinth is a beloved movie for a number of reasons, but not the least of which was Muppets and David Bowie. And I spent a whole lot of time talking about David Bowie in this movie because I love me some Bowie, and who doesn't, frankly? But this movie is beloved by a certain generation of people, and I say that because we questioned in the video whether or not this movie really holds up, or if it's just nostalgia that really gives it the reputation and is it earned. And I posited that if you grew up with it, if you saw it as a child, you probably still have love for it, but that adults who see it for the first time, maybe it doesn't work for them as much because it maybe objectively it's not as great of a movie. We talked about Jennifer Connelly maybe not giving the best of performances as a child. We talked about some of the puppetry work being puppetry work, frankly, and it may not really quite hold up to what you remember as a kid. But if you have those fond memories, it does hold up quite a bit because it's just a beloved movie. The songs are still catchy. The Muppets are still cute. The story's still fun. And if you have the nostalgia, embrace that. But it maybe ain't as great as you remember if you looked at it without the nostalgia glasses, unfortunately. The next dark fantasy movie we covered was Pan's Labyrinth. And we talked about how this masterpiece from visionary director Guillermo del Toro is just absolutely beautiful. It's gorgeous filmmaking. The magical fantasy elements are so wonderful, and they were highlighted in the trailer. But they kind of hide or mask the really bleak, dark realism of the war backsetting and backstory that this movie is set in, the backdrop that it's set in. And it's very, very heavy subject matter. It's really dark stuff that you wouldn't think to look at the trailer how dark this movie actually gets. And there's a debate as to whether or not that's a good thing because it kind of seems like a movie that's made for kids, but it's really not made for kids. It's really heavy stuff, but it's really good. The movie has weight behind it. It has drama behind it. It has stakes in it. And those fantastical elements are weaved in really well, and they are actualized and visualized and realized so wonderfully. This movie is just a treat to look at. It's Guillermo del Toro, so you couldn't already know that, but it really is one of his absolute best from a visual perspective. And again, from a narrative, heart, drama perspective, this movie is pretty much a masterpiece, and it's a must-see. And the last dark fantasy movie we talked about was Heavenly Creatures. And we talked a lot about Heavenly Creatures being made by Peter Jackson pre Lord of the Rings. Here's Lord of the Rings again. And it's the film debut for Kate Winslet. It's got Melanie Linsky. And it's based on this New Zealand true story of these two girls that killed one of their mothers. And it's very, very dark subject matter, and the realism aspect of it, the true story aspect of it, and a real true story, not like a horror movie true story, but a bona fide true story, really adds a layer of seriousness to this that you wouldn't expect from your dark fantasy movies. But the fantasy parts of this are fantastic. You can imagine Peter Jackson knows what he's doing, and he just brings that world to life in a way that is both fun and beautiful, but also tragic and sad at the same time, because he's focusing more on the relationship between these two girls rather than the luridness of the crime. It's there, but he focuses more on the relationship and how the fantasy elements are a part of their shared experience and this shared love that they have for each other. Platonic or romantic, hard to say, and it's part of the movie, but focusing on this relationship was a great way to tackle this movie and give it kind of a wonderful heart and gravitas that it maybe otherwise wouldn't get in like a true crime movie. And the fantasy elements are just the cherry on top. It's a wonderful movie that's criminally underseen and underappreciated. So those are the movies we looked at in our previous video. Now let's get to our doctorate level selection. Our doctorate level selection for dark fantasy is Horns. Horns came out in 2013 and was directed by Alexandra Aja, who we've talked about quite a bit on the channel and is known more for gore and stuff like that. So this is an interesting movie for him to be making, but I like Aja a lot, so that's kind of boding well. And it's based on a book written by Joe Hill, who is the son of Stephen King and is also an accomplished writer in his own right. So the pedigree's strong, so there's a lot of reasons to think this movie is a success, and I think it is, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. First, if you haven't seen it before, the movie stars Daniel Radcliffe as a young man who's been charged with murdering his girlfriend, and the small town he lives in believes he did it, and they've kind of made him a pariah as they await him to be going to trial. And he wants to solve the mystery of who killed her because he doesn't think it's him. But he's also developed these horns that everybody can see, but nobody seems too bothered by. But they seem to be giving him powers, as everybody who he talks to feels compelled to share their most deepest, darkest secrets and act out their most horrible fantasies. And we're going to go ahead and stop there before I spoil the movie too much, because the movie deserves to be seen. This is a really interesting and fun concept that feels pretty fresh and original, and it's very compelling as a hook. The movie jumps into this right away. Radcliffe starts getting the horns right away. You're dropped into this mystery of his girlfriend having been murdered, and you assume it's not him because he's the protagonist of the movie. So you're already kind of getting roped into the mystery, and then the horns show up, and there's really not a clear explanation for why, and then you start to deduce pretty quickly what he can do with them, and it's all pretty fun, pretty interesting. It feels like a fresh hook that I was sucked into the first time I saw this right away. Now, it helps that you've got Daniel Radcliffe anchoring the movie, and he is a very good actor who gets underrated because of the Harry Potter stuff. Like, people kind of just, he's kind of, married to that role. Like, people will always synonymously think of him as Harry Potter. But he really does a really good job of leaving Harry Potter behind in this movie. His performance is really compelling because it's bleakly kind of funny and comedic, because this movie is a funny movie, but it also has a pathos to it that I think is pretty strong. He's got a lot of anger in him because of what has happened to him and what has happened to his girlfriend. And he's got this bitterness and this edge to his character that you saw it, I guess, in a little bit of the later Harry Potter movies, but he's very convincing here. And it's a really strong performance. And again, as the fantastical elements of this kick in, he keeps the movie feeling grounded. And he really holds it together in a way that could be a hard thing for a lesser actor to do. He's underrated in general, and I think he was underrated in this movie. But it really is Aja doing something, frankly, a little bit different, like I said, from what he normally does. He's a little bit more tamed, a little more tamped down in this movie. There are some moments of gore in here, but it's not the kind of gleeful gore and sleaze that you're used to with Aja. And that's fine because it fits the tone of this movie a little bit more. Now, let me be clear. He's not like being G-rated or anything like that. This is not a movie for kids, right? This is still an adult movie, and it's not, it's dark fantasy, but it's really, really real too, because you've got this young woman who's been raped and murdered, and this whole court case going on, everything like that, and this small community that's being kind of torn apart by this, and mourning parents and stuff like that. It's got some heavy stuff going on in there for a dark fantasy movie. These dark fantasy elements maybe a little light, at least earlier on in the movie, but it really does wind up going into the dark fantasy realm and being firmly cemented in that subgenre as the movie goes on. But it's Aja doing something a little bit different, and I appreciate that. But he's still defining some directorial flair in this movie. There's some really fun and clever shots in this movie, but they're not too showy. For the most part, he's telling it pretty straightforward and doing just a very good, capable directing job. He's still allowing his actors to do their thing, and he's still giving the camera work just enough flair and interest to keep it moving and keep you drawn in, because it is a little bit of a long movie and you can feel the length sometimes, but it's still captivating enough and engaging enough that you don't ever get tapped out on it. Now, again, Radcliffe's holding this down, and you're with him the whole time, so he's a big part of what keeps the movie moving. But his supporting cast is outstanding, really. You've got James Remar, you've got Kathleen Quinlan, David Morse, you've got Juno Temple as the murdered girlfriend, you've got Max Minghella as his best friend, you've even got Sabrina Carpenter as a flashback version of the girlfriend as a younger child. Sabrina Carpenter acting as a child here. She's actually quite good in the movie. Everybody's quite good here. Heather Graham shows up for a small role. It's a really strong cast, and everybody's doing good work, and they're often playing it kind of big, and not like camp big. But this movie is bleakly funny. It's darkly comedic, and it works. The tone is right. Like, I wouldn't call this a horror comedy. I think some people do label a horror comedy. I wouldn't call it that. I would just call it a dark fantasy horror film with comedic elements to it. But the comedy works for me by and large in this movie. It really does like straddle that tone pretty well. Aja does a good job of keeping the balance right, and the actors are really bringing the dry sense of humor to this in just the right doses. But the characters are all compelling to me. And again, I'm going to credit the actors for a lot of this, because everybody's doing a really good job of making their characters feel like fully fleshed out, well-rounded characters. And I'm invested in them and what's going on in their lives. And then, there's a lot of flashbacks to when they were kids here, which I don't know if Joe Hill's taken a page out of Stephen King's repertoire there by having the kid aspects of it, but the kids are compelling. They're interesting. And I'm wrapped up in their drama and their storylines, and, them falling in love and stuff like that, and the friend relationships and everything. And I'm invested in all of that. I care about these characters. I'm really into them. And in fact, that becomes a problem later on, because some of the plot points or story points that are brought up in this movie, not plot points, more story points, aspects of these characters are just kind of left behind. They don't get resolved. So some of the story points get dropped. Characters that I cared about don't get a resolution that I felt was satisfying, right? So that's an aspect to it that's a little bit of a ding, which may explain why this movie's not super well loved, right? The critics don't love this movie, and it doesn't really seem like it gets talked about that much. People do talk about it. It's got its fans, but it doesn't get talked about a whole lot. And I think it might be because some of the story points get left behind. The killer stuff, the reveal, is a little bit, I don't know, it's a little over the top. It's a little bit stretch my imagination, suspend my disbelief a little bit. But it doesn't matter so much, because while the ending might not be super duper satisfying, and the mystery itself I think might be a little easy to guess. I guessed the first time I watched it, I guessed it pretty easily what was going to happen. It didn't matter so much to me, because I felt like the characters and their stories were interesting, their relationships were interesting, and the powers of the horns was interesting. The idea of the horns and the influence they have on people to kind of confess their deepest, darkest desires and then act them out is both funny and terrifying in the movie, and I found that part fascinating. In fact, I kind of wanted to do even more of that, but the movie runs a little long as it is. But I actually kind of started to forget a little bit about the mystery aspect of the movie, and really wanted to see what would happen with Daniel Radcliffe with these horns and all the people he interacts with, and what he gets them to do and what he gets them to say. That stuff was really interesting, really, really cool. And again, a fresh idea, a fresh concept that I loved. I really, really, really like horns a lot. And it's kind of a bummer, because it seems like very few people do, right? And that's why I picked it for the Doctorate Level selection. Not because people don't know about it, or it's obscure, but because people don't love it. It didn't get really great reviews. It kind of came and went, and people Like I said, it comes up every once in a while in conversations, but I do feel like it's a grossly underrated movie. I think it's very well directed. I think the performances across the board are very, very good, especially Daniel Radcliffe. I think that the little bits of gore you do get in are fun, and I think that the fantasy elements of it are super duper strong. I'm really into that aspect of the movie. Yeah, the mystery's a little bit weak. Yeah, the ending might be a little bit limp, a little unsatisfying. If you want to see some justice, maybe you're not going to be 100% satisfied with it. But I think the good far outweighs the bad. So I'm super into horns, and if you guys are too, let me know because I feel like I'm on an island. And if you guys like it, let me know. But if you haven't seen it, I'd strongly recommend checking it out. It's a very well made movie, very well acted, very fun story, very much worth your time. So check it out and let me know what you think. So that's our doctorate level selection for dark fantasy, but I also have an extra credit movie I want to talk to you about because it's something else, man. This one's a trip. Our extra credit movie is Valerie and Her Week of Wonders. Valerie and Her Week of Wonders came out in 1970 and is based on a 1935 book of the same name, and it's a Czechoslovakian film. It's part of the Czechoslovakian New Wave, which is known for, amongst other things, being a rather surreal type of filmmaking, and this movie definitely lives up to that for sure. Now, if you haven't seen it before, the movie is about a young girl who's been orphaned and is being raised by her grandmother. And she has this pair of earrings that apparently are somewhat magical. And they get stolen by a young boy who becomes kind of a love interest for the girl. And he gives them back to her because he's trying to protect her from this vampire creature who also has some sort of connection with the grandmother. And all of this is happening in the midst of a sexual awakening for this young girl that frankly winds up being somewhat uncomfortable to say the least. But I'm going to go ahead and stop there so as to not spoil the movie too much. But it would be a little hard to spoil this movie because this movie is surreal is a word for it. Sure, confusing is another one for it. Strange is probably the easiest one to go with. It's a very strange movie, but damn if it's not beautiful. This movie is beautifully shot. It's got this dreamlike, ethereal quality that just kind of like you kind of feel like you're floating throughout this movie, like just kind of floating through it, and it's just kind of like images kind of being just washed over you. The narrative is there, but it's convoluted and weird and hard to follow, and really not tremendously all that important because you're kind of here for the very strange and hypnotic imagery, but you kind of need to follow the story, I guess, to kind of understand what's going on. But it's hard to understand what's going on because it is a strange story. The movie apparently operates as some kind of commentary on Czech culture and the political climate at the time in the 1960s and then into the 1970s, of course. But I don't know enough about that historically to really opine as to whether or not it's successful in that. There is some diatribe about this being a bit of an anti-Catholic stance and kind of a comparison about Catholicism and its edicts on sexual morality, and I can see that one a little bit more strongly because there are priests in the movie and they are shown in not the best of light, and there is a lot of sexuality in this movie and sexual progressiveness and sexual awakening and sexual explicitness and stuff, and so it makes sense that people would have that kind of reading for the movie. And I think it's there. I think that aspect of it is potentially there because there is, this whole sexuality versus the church kind of aspect to it there. But that's not even the most controversial part of this movie by a long shot. I'd say the real controversy of this movie lies in the lead actor who plays Valerie, Yanoslava Shalarova, who was 13 years old when she makes this movie. And she is eroticized heavily in this movie. Right from the get-go, you're seeing shots of her where she's wearing this flowy dress, and there's like these shots that are almost kind of going down her shirt, like her blouse is kind of loose and it's kind of like peeking down her shirt almost, and it's already uncomfortable right off the bat because even if you don't know that she's 13, it's very clear in the movie that she is a child, right? And she's not a woman, but the movie is focusing, at least in part, on her kind of sexual awakening, her discovering of romance and sex, and it goes into some very difficult things. There's a whole scene with a priest who tries to sexually assault her that is wildly disturbing for a number of reasons, not the least of which, of course, is just the obvious, sexual abuse of a child aspect. It doesn't go very far, so there's that. But on top of that, there is the nudity aspect of it. this scene and a few other scenes, Yaroslava Shalarova is nude in the movie, and she's showing, again, 13 years old, and they are showing her nude. They're showing her topless. They're showing her bottomless. It's uncomfortable. Now, this movie is coming off like an art movie, right? It's shot like an art house film. It's shot very beautiful movie, gorgeous movie, but it's still uncomfortable, man. Like I said, even if you didn't know she was 13 years old, like you can tell she's too young. And it maybe reminds me a little bit of the early work of Brooke Shields, who did some nudity and stuff like that too. And it's 1970, so I understand that the sexual mores and the political climate and the social climate is different then. I get that. I understand that. And maybe this is part of why this movie doesn't get talked about very much, and I get that too, because it's uncomfortable. It is. You feel weird watching it. I feel weird watching it, but I do acknowledge how beautiful this movie is. And I understand, again, it's about this imagery, which is captivating imagery over the narrative, which is strange and convoluted and hard to follow, frankly. You've got these surreal vampires that honestly kind of dip into camp a little bit. Like they're kind of goofy, they're kind of weird and silly, and they don't necessarily follow all of the normal like tropes and lore of vampires, but they are visually arresting. They are very interesting, and it just the movie just is gorgeous. The dreamlike quality of it, the almost painterly shots are just really outstanding. It really eye popping, and again, captivating is the word I keep coming back to when I think of the imagery of this movie. It just sucks you in, and it just kind of takes you on this ride. And not for nothing, I think that there's some stuff on Wikipedia that talks about how this movie was an influence for The Company of Wolves, which I don't believe we've talked about, but I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about that in the not too distant future. But other than that, this movie doesn't really have a lot of buzz, and I'm guessing it's because of the controversy of the young actress at the heart of it all. And if you can get past that, if you can stomach that, it's a movie that's well worth watching, because again, it's just so gorgeous and so interesting, and it makes you feel a certain way. But then underlying that is this uncomfortableness, which I think adds a layer of interest to the movie, but also makes you feel uncomfortable, right? So take that one as you will, as a recommendation. It's not going to be for everybody, and if you think it's a despicable movie because of that, I ain't gonna fight you on it, but I have to say how gorgeous it is and how interesting it is, from just a aesthetic standpoint, and then from just the kind of the commentary that they're trying to make with it. I think it's a fascinating movie, but again, a taboo one for sure. So those are my thoughts for the Doctor Level selection and revisiting of the dark fantasy subgenre. Like I said, these movies can be really, really interesting, and these ones that I picked today are very, very interesting and worth your time. If you do check them out, if you haven't seen them before and you check them out, let me know what you think, because like I said, I've got some strong opinions on these, or maybe not, just like divergent opinions, not strong, but divergent opinion on these, and I'd be curious to see if you guys align or you feel differently. So please share that in the comments below. And now I'm going to share a Horror Trivia Pursuit card. I'm going to read this card live on camera like I do and try to answer it and hopefully not embarrass myself. And today, let's go with the paranormal subgenre or category on the card, because we're talking about dark fantasy, and that's the closest we can get on this card, frankly. So here's the question. In 1979's The Amityville Horror, which character becomes obsessed with cutting firewood? Okay. I both know the answer to this question and don't know the answer to this question. And the reason why is because I struggle with character names, frankly. Now, that said, the Amityville Horror is based on an alleged true story about the DeFeo family being murdered in that house. And so that helps a little bit, but it also doesn't help because that's not the name of the family in the movie. And so I'm kind of giving you clues here, I guess, but like, so that's where I say I can kind of know and don't know the answer to this, and like that's not the family that's in the movie. I think that's the family that comes later, and I get it confused about the names and stuff like that. And it doesn't really matter, frankly. But we have talked about the Amityville Horror on the channel, because it is a seminal ghost, haunted house type movie, pretty well known, pretty famous, but also kind of overrated a little bit. I'll be honest with you. Like, it's a slow movie, and we've talked about it, and we don't need to go on to that again. But I'm not the only one who has that opinion. It's a shared opinion. But anyways, all that to say is maybe you haven't seen that movie. You know what I mean? It's again, it's kind of a horror classic, but it's also one that I would argue maybe I kind of skipped that one, frankly. So maybe you haven't seen it. And if you haven't seen it, then maybe you don't know the answer to this question. But you might even be able to do deductive reasoning if you know the characters in there. But if you don't, that doesn't help you very much, right? So anyways, I've pratted on long enough. It's time for me to lock in an answer. And I'm going to give you my kind of hard to decipher answer, but bear with me here. So my answer is that it's Chris Christopherson's character. That's the actor playing the dad in the movie. So it's the dad who gets obsessed with chopping firewood. It's Chris Christopherson. And Mr. Lutz, I think it's the Lutz family that is the family that's in the movie. I'll be damned if I can remember his first name, though. So Mr. Lutz, played by Chris Christopherson. That's my answer. So the card says George Lutz. George Lutz. So do I get full credit for that, guys? I said Mr. Lutz. I said Chris Christopherson. You guys going to give me full credit on that one, or is that only partial credit on that one? Let me know in the comments below if I deserve partial credit on that one. Also, let me know if you got it right, or if you guessed something else. Did you say like Mr. DeFeo? Because that would make sense to me, but I told you not to do that. Anyways, thank you very much for hanging out to the end of this video. Thank you guys for the recommendations you make in the videos comments. I keep those coming because we can keep cranking out these syllabus-worthy videos. I appreciate you guys and everything you do. Thanks for hanging out. And until next week, when we do something completely different, I'm just going to say, class dismissed.